Yeah, I learned a really valuable technique or lesson, I guess, when I was working in Pivotal because, I was building DevSecOps infrastructures, right? And to build, it's the same thing with AI. When you're building those types of infrastructures, it's not just IT. It's not just applications. You have to talk to the CISO. You have to talk to the head of applications. You've got to talk to the CTO, the CIO. Everybody needs to be on board. And it's really the same thing with AI because it really touches everybody. Everybody's got different concerns in each one of those departments. And if you don't address every single one of those, you're missing out on either an opportunity to make it work the best way it can or a potential problem that's going to hit you down the road.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Enterprises everywhere are racing to deploy AI, but not all of them are ready for what comes next. Without the right people, processes, and platforms in place, AI can introduce just as many risks as opportunities. Today's guest, Tim Piemonte, president and co-founder at Tribeca Softech, has spent his career helping organizations modernize their infrastructure, strategy, and security posture to make sure AI actually delivers value. Before launching Tribeca, Tim led strategic growth and cloud initiatives at Dell, EMC, Pivotal, and Tanium, and now works directly with enterprises to align technology with business outcomes. Tim, welcome to Pioneers.
Ankur, great to see you again. Thank you for that great introduction. It's an exciting time in the market. AI is everywhere. Everybody's excited about it. What I like to focus on is the strategy to develop and implement AI for corporations effectively because there's a lot of pitfalls that can happen, right? And to do it safely and strategically is something I'm really, really interested in.
You said something earlier during our prep call that really stuck with me, that a lot of companies are deploying AI without a strategy.
Mm.
What does this look like in practice?
So, I see it all the time, and it's a shame because I see going into companies and they talk about their failed AI initiatives. And, I like to look at everything in the environment. You've got to look at the people, you have to look at the process, you have to look at the platforms that they're using because they all play a part. If one of those fails, you're really setting yourself up for failure. The automation and the augmentation is something great, but you've really got to do the front end legwork to make sure that your team's ready for it and your enterprise, your infrastructure is also ready for it.
When you think about the blocking element around AI adoption, AI adding real impact, what would you say some of the biggest blockers are? Because I assume a lot of that happens because the strategy perhaps wasn't the right strategy going into it, and people find out that after the fact, essentially.
Yeah, sure. So there's really two things. One is there's friction inside the enterprise to begin with. AI is, it can be daunting, and if you've got a team or a group of C-level executives that aren't all on board and ready to commit to it, you're going to run into some friction. The second thing is I see some corporations that have their AI teams that are, they have a gap in skill set. And if you've got that gap in skill set, you really need to work on educating that team before you roll out an AI implementation. And if you can do those two things, get everybody on board with the initiative and what you're doing, as well as the security team, and you've got the people that are going to be running it and implementing it on board and educated, you're setting yourself up for success.
Yeah, it's not just about the tools that get introduced, it's how people use them. And
That's
sometimes that
correct.
AI fluency ends up being the blocking factor because if people aren't using the tools, regardless of how great the tools are, you don't have adoption. And therefore, without adoption, you won't have impact, right? And so
Yeah.
that ends up becoming a big blocker from our own experience as
You
well.
know what's another one I see is the interdependencies, right? So you've got, there's low hanging fruit, obviously, like client onboarding, operational automation, loan origination, and data processing, all relatively low hanging fruit. However, when you start to implement some of the other more complex AI use cases, like international wire transfers or some of the applications that touch end to end infrastructures, you really need to look at those interdependencies, right? Because
Mhm.
if you break one of those interdependencies, you're potentially causing some big issues, some complex issues inside of the environment. So I see a lot of failure to, do the pre-work to determine those interdependencies and what's touching what to really model out, how this is going to flow through the system.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think there are two types of AI in some ways that are being introduced. There are features that are AI or AI enabled within a given application. So in some ways, it's guardrailed because it's within the application. It's not affecting anything before or after that. It's making the application, the software piece in isolation better off because there's some AI enablement. And I think that is valuable. But I think what we often hear, and I'm curious what your perspective is that the real value from AI is how can you get AI that weaves in and out of the different applications that people use? Because people don't use just one application to drive value. They're going from one application to another, right? Even if it's like inbox and an application, they go back and forth, and the ability for AI to go back and forth and work within multiple systems, that's really where the bulk of the value of AI, like agentic AI especially, is going to be. So that's
Mhm.
where it seems like the interdependency component really comes into play.
Yeah, true. It really starts with, creating the ability to access all of the data in a company, right? So if you're moving from application to application and you want to use agentic AI and AI across an infrastructure, setting yourself up with the access to that data is a perfect way to do it. But again, you've almost got to, make sure that everyone's on board with that, because you don't want to create that shadow IT, right? Where employees are downloading AI tools,
Mhm.
without that security oversight. You mentioned something to me that I loved, it's chaos disguised as progress, where, hey, we're doing all this great stuff, but then, you're really creating those chaotic sort of models when the messaging and the initiative, the positive business outcomes are
Mhm.
not identified up front. I think that's an important part of what we try and do.
Are we seeing like shadow use of AI even on personal devices?
Yeah.
Is that a result of maybe enterprises not moving quickly enough with their purchase decisions, or why are we seeing this? Because like the easier thing would be to do is an individual or set of individuals want to use a particular AI tool,
Mhm.
they would go and bring that up the chain of command, and then you'd make a bigger purchase decision. I'm just wondering what's causing people to kind of use like the shadow IT portion, as you mentioned, as opposed to kind of going through the proper channels.
Well, I think there's two things. I think that people are excited to use AI, right? There's a lot of cool things that happen, and you can get some great output quickly, right? And people want to use that. But I think there's a reluctance by enterprises to really, open that door without doing the proper foresight. So what happens is exactly what you just said. People use it without the oversight and the security, and it sort of is. You're correct. I think enterprise is not moving quickly enough to make it accessible to their employees, but you've got to move quickly but in a proper fashion to make
Mm-hmm.
sure those guardrails are up, and you've got all that pre-work done to make sure
Yeah.
that you're not breaking things and implementing it properly.
Well, great. Well, I think we mentioned people, process, platform as three pillars.
Hmm.
When you start to work with clients at Tribeca Softech, what do you start with? Is it technology? Is it strategy? Or is it something else?
So it definitely starts with the people. I always start with, the CISO, the CTO, the CIO, and get their take on what their initiatives are, right? So we need to learn how they're trying to use, AI. Is it to provide more value to the clients? Is it deep research? Is it, like the international wire transfers in a financial institution, maybe? Or is it the simple things like, client onboarding and compliance and automation? I think those are all great use cases, but I really want to learn how an enterprise is what they're trying to accomplish, right? Because then what I do from there is I look at the people, take those initiatives and try and find out if the people are ready. Do they have the skills to make those changes, right? And then it flows into the processes. Are the workflows in place? What does the infrastructure look like? Like that's when I introduce multimodal into an account where you've got a platform that's already got a great security built into it, and set of tools that are ready to use. Rather than building that, I can, we together can formulate that to provide a great platform to launch some of those use cases that we're talking about. But if any of those three aren't ready, the infrastructure, the people, or the process, you've got to figure that out beforehand.
Yeah, I think that deeply resonates with our own experience. It's one of the reasons why we enjoy working with you, because I think you help pave the ground for the platform to be effective, right? It comes down to what are the where are the people today? What are the business use cases? What do the existing processes look like? Because then when you walk into the room, you have much more clarity as to where the pain is and then what the present state is. Then you could go and figure out where the platform can be helpful, right? And then it
Absolutely.
becomes much more informed. I think on the flip side, the mistake that we see some companies making is they view AI as a technology that should be IT and engineering led, and then the IT and engineering, they like working with new technology. I think as a technologist myself, I think it makes sense. It's a fun technology. You want to go and get your hands on it. But if you do not do the like work that you mentioned earlier, speaking with people and getting a better sense of the business pain and understanding the processes, then you're building technology for technology's sake, right? And then it doesn't progress, doesn't get adopted. It goes to the host of issues that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I learned a really valuable technique or lesson, I guess, when I was working in Pivotal, because I was building DevSecOps infrastructures, right? And to build, it's the same thing with AI. When you're building those types of infrastructures, it's not just IT. It's not just applications. You have to talk to the CISO. You have to talk to the head of applications. You've got to talk to the CTO, the CIO. Everybody needs to be on board. And it's really the same thing with AI, because it really touches everybody. Everybody's got different concerns in each one of those departments. And if you don't address every single one of those, you're missing out on either an opportunity to make it work the best way it can, or a potential problem that's going to hit you down the road. So, I really bring everybody in an enterprise together to make sure that everybody's, you know, initiatives are heard, what they want to accomplish with it, and what their concerns are, so that we can address all of that before we even do anything. I think it's really, really important to, you know, touch everybody in the enterprise and get that buy-in and hear them.
Well, let's just assume for a second that the strategy piece has been done. So you've spoken with the people, you've identified the business problems, you've understood the processes. I imagine you then have to figure out the expected impact and the expected effort in solving a business problem, because I'm sure there's like the quick wins, which are going to be like high impact, low effort, and that's like,
Yep.
yes, that's easy. But a lot of time for the really important like high impact problems, there will also be high effort, right? And then of course like there's the
Right.
other side, which is like it's high effort and just low impact. And I think if you could kind of throw them out very quickly, like those types of use cases, then you've saved yourself a lot of time. But I'm wondering how you think about the prioritization, the sequencing of which problems get worked on earlier than not, knowing that, hey, there might be a lot of problems. You might not even have full capacity with your existing teams. You're getting all this pressure, like maybe from the board or from investors or whatever it might be, to go and introduce AI. But then it's like, which problems do you start with, and how do you sequence it properly in order to tackle the large surface area of what AI potentially could be helpful with?
Yeah, that's a great question, because every enterprise is different, right? But I'll give you an example of someone we're working with today, who you're actually going to meet this week, actually, together with me. So this is a mid-tier bank, and what they're challenged with is wanting to scale without adding headcount, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is basically a cost avoidance type of initiative, which is fairly commonplace when trying to use AI. However, what they're faced with a couple challenges. First, AI is new for them, right? They don't have a strategy, so we've been working on building that strategy. But what they need is, the discovery phase to produce an ROI that makes sense, right? So they can show that, hey, there's value both monetarily and in soft costs in doing what we're doing. So what we've developed is a set of use cases that are quick wins. They're easy to accomplish. They don't impact the environment, but they do produce an ROI. What that's going to enable us to do is to get, you know, the buy-in and say, hey, this does work. There's a way to scale our enterprise without necessarily, you know, adding a lot of headcount or buying a lot of infrastructure that's costly. We can do it in a way that makes sense, produces great ROI, and has huge impact to the company in things like of client value. Like you're providing more client value to your customers, where you're either getting back to them more quickly or you're
Yeah.
providing things like deep research, right? Where you can, inform them and give them the data that they need to make good financial decisions. So it's that process, right? And you kind of ease into it. But again, it depends on how mature that enterprise is with the technology itself.
Yeah. That's a really good insight into sort of how these conversations happen. I think what is interesting is that for very large enterprises, they're in some ways viewing AI as a way to potentially reduce headcount, right? Because they just have a lot of
Mm,
people. Maybe they overhired during the early 2020s, like in 2021 and such, and you're seeing the layoffs and such. The difference is that with mid-market financial institutions, they have very good people. It's a smaller team, they have very good people. They have worked very hard to get those people, to retain them. They're really valuable to the organization. So it's not so much of a headcount reduction,
mm,
but they certainly want to do more with that team, right? Can they
right.
do more business? Can they deliver better customer experiences without having to add to headcount? And so it's about enabling people to do more and to make the customers better off. And I think you're echoing that sentiment, right? So, and I think what we find is that mid market embraces that a bit more in some ways than enterprise, because people aren't going to lose their jobs here. I think mid market is a little bit different in that regard because they have fewer people to begin with. Each person is super valuable. Like it's on a first name basis, and you have a 50-100% company. You know everyone more or less.
Right.
And so it's about how do you go and enable the very good people to do more work by offloading some of the work that maybe would have required people effort, but now with these background AI agents, the people can do more and deliver better end user outcomes.
I totally agree with you. And what I love to do is, it started with that KSA, the knowledge skills assessment that we do with, their whole team. Because what I like to do is work with the CEO, because the CEO doesn't want to lay people off, right? For the most part. But that KSA gives us the data of what that person is potentially also good at, aside
Yeah.
from their regular job that may be augmented through AI. So the ability to, you know, work with that person and develop skills in a place where they can also add value and keep their job, or just it would be a different job, is something I love to provide value around, because it makes everybody happy. They're not losing their job, they're implementing new technologies, and they still get to carry on with the corporation that they love. I
Yeah.
think it's
Yeah.
a win-win for everybody when you can do that. There may be different ideas in mind, depending upon the organization, but in general, that's what I like to do with the KSA, which everything starts with. The strategy starts with that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, then it feels very good about figuring out what technology
Exactly.
slots in to allow the people to do more of what they're good at and also want to be doing, right? And
That's
then it's
exactly
like
right.
a marriage made in heaven. So, Tim, but maybe just to go back to your earlier comment, you mentioned these quick wins
Mhm.
as kind of being the starting point. When an organization like the ones that you speak to are considering quick wins, what does that mean for them? Does that mean quick wins in the sense that we got some POCs done where maybe we showed that AI is possible to add value in this area or that? Or are they looking at quick wins as rubber hits the road? This is in production. There is real impact. And the reason why I'm framing this question is in the last, call it 3 years now with generative AI and then agentic AI, there has been a lot of experimentation, right? Maybe even experimentation fatigue of POCs after pilot after POC and kind of going in those two buckets. And there's a famous MIT study of like 95% of these don't make it into production. So I'm wondering what quick wins means in light of the POCs, pilots, production
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, well, it could be both. It could be in both pilots, and it could be in production. And if we're doing a pilot, say you and I together, I like to clearly outline what the accomplishments are going to be. What are we trying to achieve, right? And once we do that pilot, did we hit all of those? And if we didn't, why not? Let's talk about that. Maybe there's something that needs to be changed either in the environment or the process with which we're implementing it, right? Once we put it into production, I love to do something called a V2V. It's a validate the value, and it happens on a quarterly basis with every enterprise that I'm involved in. I'll go into, the CTO, the CIO, whoever it might be, and state clearly, hey, here's where we were before we implemented this technology. Here's where we are today, and put together things like, what's more efficient? Are we accomplishing things with less interaction in a more efficient time frame? Are we saving money? Are we, providing better customer value? Document all those things and validate the value, and that's a great way to accomplish the quote unquote quick win, that you're actually showing it with data to that, C-level executive board, so you can prove and give them the data they need to keep going with you and develop more and more use cases. It's worked so many great times.
Yeah.
Everybody's really happy about it. And the other thing it does is it identifies where you may have a problem. Like, hey, something's stuck here. We need to work on it, which they may or may not even have been aware of. But now, since you're doing this analysis on a quarterly basis, you say, oh, we got a problem here. We need to, work on this, fix it, augment it, change it, whatever it might be. But it brings up usually great points, sometimes things you need to work on that you might not be aware of. So that's kind of the way I go about it in both POCs and in production.
I mean, I love that because I think if you can't measure something, you can't get better on it, and you can't tie it back to like how much value is this delivering. And so, if you
Agreed.
have a really good frame early on what those use cases are, where the pain is, right, to drive those quick wins, but then you have ways to measure that on whatever dimension makes sense, then all of a sudden you have something to judge the success of the pilot and figure out whether it should move into production or not. And it allows you to kind of rigor around the different use cases and also different vendor evaluations you do or the evaluations you do internally with your team, right? I think all of them should kind of be held to the same set of KPIs that you've identified before the fact to then judge them throughout the process and then make your downstream business decisions on.
Yeah. So few people do it, and what it really does is it gives you the trust from your buyers to continue on with the more complex use cases, because you're going to need that. It's more complex for a reason, and there's some challenges that are going to be there that you might not have faced with the low hanging fruit.
Before we talk about technology and how businesses should kind of think about the build out of the technology to address the pain that they've identified, maybe let's cover why these financial institutions, as an example, come to Tribeca in the first place. Because,
Sure.
I think some of the things you're mentioning around strategy, looking at people and processes and the platform are really valuable. But I'm curious, whether they've typically done that themselves and maybe they've had not the best success, or if that's like a new framework that they're going through that Tribeca introduces. But like, what is the motivation generally for bringing Tribeca into the conversation?
Yeah, so it's really a unique model that we've built. So on the client side, new great technology companies typically don't have the leverage of a network like ours to get into some big enterprises. So once we vet a good technology and we decide to take them on as a client, they're getting the benefit of our great network and the IT expertise that we've built over, 100 plus years from the collective team at Tribeca. And then from a buyer side, meaning, the enterprises that are going to buy that technology, they're in a strange spot today because there's so much clutter in the market. I hear from CIOs all the time, everyone looks the same, everyone sounds the same.
Mhm.
How do I know what a good technology is? And we do all that vetting on the front end. Like, I want your code. I want to talk to the CEO. I want to understand exactly what your technology does, and that's when I'm introducing those clients into those enterprises. And it's, the buyers are happy because they're like, hey, you're doing our homework for us. And the
Mhm.
client's happy because, hey, I never would have gotten the exposure with some of these enterprise accounts if, I didn't have some doors being open. And then we don't just, sit there and, open the door and leave. We've been through the procurement process with all these enterprises before, so we're going to help you navigate those complex processes too inside an organization. So it's some cool stuff that we're providing into the marketplace that's different from anything anyone else is doing.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think it's in some ways like you become the marketplace, which is you have buyers and vendors, and you're trying to make sure that they pair well and that there's real value being delivered. And you do work on both sides in evaluating vendors and then
Yep.
helping validate like the business need, the business pain, getting the business buyers well situated so that they're ready to even begin evaluating vendors
Correct.
successfully. So neither party, the financial institutions nor the technology vendors are kind of wasting cycles and time and like misfiring in terms of matching up with one another, and you're kind of
That's
helping
right.
kind of facilitate that and see that through. So
in
definitely
many
could see
in
a lot
many
of deep value.
instances we already understand the requirements of these enterprise buyers because we've worked with them for years and years, and we're familiar with who's operating what departments and what their challenges are, and what their initiatives are for the future. That takes time to understand.
Yep.
And by bringing a client and giving them the value of that knowledge beforehand is cutting out a lot of data gathering that you would need to do otherwise.
Let's turn to the classic enterprise dilemma, and I think you've alluded to this before. But once you've gone through the people and the processes, you've identified the pain, you've figured out which use cases could be quick wins. Then it's the classic question of, do you build internally? Do you buy tooling that you then build on top of? And I think a third camp is emerging, which is like partnering maybe through some forward deployed work with a vendor that is a software vendor, but they're also kind of leaning in and partnering in the build out of, let's say, AI agents and such. But I'm curious, how you help an enterprise navigate that build, buy, partner conversation. And I think you said something earlier that I think is really relevant, which is from the buyer's perspective, there's a sea of AI tools and vendors, which may be different, of course, like under the hood, but from a first glance perspective, they all kind of sound and look very similar, which makes the whole like which company should you buy from or partner with very difficult, which maybe then causes enterprises to kind of stay in the build or do DIY camp. So I'm curious how you help the enterprise navigate through that decision making framework.
Yeah, I get that question a lot, which is interesting. But unless you're a Goldman Sachs type company where you've got, billions of dollars and like hundreds of engineers that can roll this type of stuff out, for somebody to go about it alone is a tricky one. By the time you actually build something, it's probably already outdated, right? And you're behind the times already. Platforms like yours, like Agent Flow, they're solving for the integration and the security so you can deploy these technologies with everything already built in. You don't have to worry about things you might have missed, and that allows you to focus on your use cases. I think it's a perfect way to go. And then to take it to the next level, you take multimodal's agent flow and you can build on top of that if you wanted to. You know what I mean? You've got the foundation already set up,
Mm-hmm.
and then you could snap in some other technologies. It's usually just a simple API plugin for the most part, where you can do some custom development, but the foundation is solid and it's there. So I encourage really anyone other than those big enterprise organizations that have resources to do it themselves, to buy a great foundation like multimodal so that they can set themselves up the correct way.
How would you encourage enterprises to evaluate vendors, right, that they're trying to buy from or partner with? As an example, like Multimodal's platform, because I
Yeah,
think the challenge becomes, okay, well, if you maybe you've made an attempt to build on your own, or maybe you perhaps know better in terms of like your existing resource capacity and kind of go out and have a frame of buying or partnering. And that actually simplifies the framework. I think it's when you're at a certain size where you have engineering resources and then you're trying to figure out what to build internally versus not. And I think I generally agree with you that unless you're a Goldman Sachs or a JP Morgan, or just a very sophisticated, like technically oriented, maybe more software first type of financial institution, you're going to benefit a lot from partnering with software vendors, especially when the environment's so fluid, things change so fast that if you try to build something, and we've seen this, for example, and I'll give you an example just here now, but we've seen this where companies go out to build something. By the time they actually deliver it, it's already a year or more out of date. The
exactly.
best example that I can think of is in 23, everyone wanted to build their own ChatGPT, essentially
Mm-hmm.
clone. They started to build it, and by the time they shipped it, let's say like in 24, the ChatGPT version that was out was dramatically better from what the teams were building, and so it just
Exactly.
wasn't competitive. And then I think people kind of threw their hat in the ring at some point. A lot of institutions did, because ChatGPT Enterprise or Claude for Finance, as an example, they're just dramatically better than what these companies can build on their own, right? It's just the foundation model companies themselves are building better experiences. Not to mention then the real agentic AI startups are catering to finance. They're building even beyond on top of that. And then it's like you're never going to be able to catch up. And so then the choice gets to who do you buy from, who do you partner with? So Tim, maybe on that, could you maybe help frame how enterprises should go through that evaluation process, especially if they don't have a Tribeca to help do the evaluation
Yeah,
on their behalf?
yeah. No, that's a great question. So, you know, of a lot of the clients that I work with, they have a focus, right? Like multimodal is finance and insurance, right? So you've got these companies that are very, very good at maybe a focus that your enterprise is built around. I mean, that's an obvious way to sort of, pare down the options that you have. You do a very good job in a specific instance. Not to say that your platform can't grow to service other industries, but that's what you're good at, and why would you really look anywhere else? So there's those types of choices that you have out in the marketplace today for different, what your business is built around. So I would encourage, you can certainly make some choices that way quickly.
And the other thing I think gets missed often is the amount of work it takes to get the information security right, the compliance right, things like audit trails, execution logs, explainability, which is really important in the regulated space. Each of these are deep, complex builds. And then when you think about having to do that per workflow, per agent, do it at a dozen or dozens of time over, becomes really hard. And that's just like the initial build. But then talk about the maintenance, given how quickly AI is evolving. Who's going to maintain it 6, 12, 2,
Yeah,
3, 4, 5 years out? Especially when a lot of the people that built it at any given financial institution, they have a tenure that might on average be like 2 to 3 years on the
right.
engineering side. And so the person that built it certainly isn't going to be here in 3 years time to maintain it. So how do you then manage that complexity,
Yeah,
right? Whereas
yeah,
with software partners, if you choose appropriately, then they're investing a tremendous amount of time in not only getting that platform to add value, but then they're investing in the platform so it gets more competitive, it gets better over time. And they're going to be that partner for years down the line, 5, 10, 15 years, in
that's
a
right.
way that no single individual engineer would be, right? And so I think that also
Absolutely.
becomes really important.
Yeah, and you touched on something because the CISO job is a hard job, right? I mean, people don't necessarily love the CISO. They're the ones, making applications inaccessible, but they have a job, a very important job. And I think when we start to implement AI, it's important to keep security as part of the culture, right? So you have to involve security. The CISO needs that visibility so that, we can do amazing things for compliance and operations. It's got to be part of the process rather than something that's looked upon as, hey, let's not tell the CISO because they're just going to shut it down. No, that's not the way to go about it. It's got to be part of the culture. And I think everything works out better that way. And, the CISO, in my mind, is going to have the most important job coming up with quantum computing. And I know you and I touched on that a little bit. And
Yeah.
the correlation between quantum computing and AI is amazing. But there's going to be some crazy things happening in the near future. So I think that the CISO is an extremely important part of the process, the evaluation, the decision making committee, so that you can properly implement this technology and truly do good things in a secure fashion.
No, I think that's a really great point. CISO is someone that is there to do a very, very important job. And I think making it part of the conversation is really important from day one, right? And I think if you can figure out a way to partner with the CISO from day one, it makes the lives of everyone easier. And I think a lot of people think about security from just an external threat perspective, but one of the biggest things that we think about and solve for our customers is just information access internally. So when you have a larger financial institution, every single individual shouldn't be privy and have access to all of the information at that organization. No data works that way today, but AI makes it more challenging because AI technically could have access to all the data and then could potentially surface information that a given individual shouldn't have access to, shouldn't be privy
True.
to. So creating the right access levels internally within the organization is just as important. And it's something that we help solve for. Again, another very complex, thorny problem that if you had to figure it out on your own, it would just be very hard to do. And then, it's like, it's just, it's hard to do and hard to maintain. And I think this is where having a software vendor help solve for this makes a huge difference. It's just one additional headache that you could not have to take on your shoulders.
Right. Why would you want to build a whole RBAC, infrastructure if it already comes built into your platform? I mean, it makes perfect sense where you can be sure that you're, not giving access to people that shouldn't have access to that data, as they're rolling out, an AI initiative. It's a to me, it's common sense, but not everyone thinks like we do sometimes, and it's an important part of what needs to be done. I agree with you.
And I think your advice is going to be really helpful, especially as people think about how to get more value and more impact from their investments in AI. So maybe to follow up here, if you had to distill all of this insight and knowledge into a playbook for enterprise leaders starting their own AI journey today, what three things should they focus on first?
Well, that's a good question. I think I'm going to start with, what I really believe in. Make sure that your people understand AI and its limits, right? Start with that skills assessment, start with the education, really find out, how your people are going to use AI and what its initiatives are, right? The second would probably be, get a roadmap, let's develop a strategy. Start, find out what is the low risk, quick wins, good ROI, easy to implement, won't break the process, and prove the value. So, because undoubtedly you're going to have internal people that are against change, against AI for whatever reason, right? So, if you can map that out and get those quick wins in the ROI, I think that's a great thing. And finally, put the security and the governance at the forefront, involve that team so that it's not an afterthought, because when it's an afterthought, it's a problem. And if you can, incorporate that and have that security and governance in place, you're really setting yourself up for some great success.
Amazing. I love that. It's education, it's mapping out the use cases to drive
Yes,
impact, and then it's the security governance trust piece, which is pivotal, right? You cannot kind of view that as a last minute consideration. It has to be part of the initial frame you have.
absolutely. I think we can do some great things together. I'm excited about it.
Yeah. Well, Tim, this has been an incredible conversation from AI readiness to quantum security, even. You've given leaders a realistic view of what it takes to make AI happen so that it's strategic, not chaotic. And for our listeners who want to learn more about Tribeca Softech or connect with you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Sure, I'm active on LinkedIn. They can always go to tribecasoftech.com and learn more about us. And we've got a great team, happy to help any way possible, whether it's a new technology or an enterprise looking to roll out an AI strategy. Happy to help. And thank you for having me, Encore. I really had a good time. You're a great host and appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks again for joining us, Tip. Thanks everyone to listening. Don't forget to subscribe to Pioneers for more conversations at the intersection of AI, security, and enterprise innovation. Until next time.